This video is going to teach you how to discern whether an article you found online is actually a research article or not. Not every article published in a journal or published online in a database is a research article. So the IMRaD format is a good way to kind of quickly figure out, is this research or is this just an informational, good to know article? And if it is just informational, then we don't need to use that as evidence for evidence-based practice. So let's kind of look in at what IMRaD stands for and what that typically looks like in both quantitative and qualitative research studies. So first of all, IMRaD stands for Introduction, Method, Results, and Discussion. So that's the typical format for any journal article based research study that you're going to find. So each one of those has typical themes that you see within there. And so we're going to talk about what you would typically expect to find in an introduction, a method, results, and of course, discussion. So, but before we do that, let's talk about the title and the abstract of research study articles. Most of the time we're busy. We don't have time to sit and read a ton of study articles, especially if we're not sure it's even addressing the question or the problem that we're interested in learning more about. So a good, well-written title should tell you the key phenomena or variables under study in that particular research study. So a good title should tell you that, as well as usually the population that it's being studied. So is it adolescents? Is it elder adults living in assisted living facilities? A good title will tell you that information. And when you're screening through search results in a database, read the title first. Does it sound like it pertains to your topic? If so, put it in a list or put it in a folder and then keep screening through titles. Once you've screened through the titles and you think all of the ones you've kept actually address your topic that you're interested in, then you read the abstract, which is typically somewhere around 200 words, give or take, depending on the journal publisher and their guidelines. And that abstract gives you a real quick glance of what was learned and what was studied and kind of the methods and the population under study and that kind of stuff. So after you've read the abstract, you should have a very good idea, is this study relevant? Does this answer the evidence-based practice question that I'm asking for my project I'm working on? And if the answer is yes, then you move into reading or skimming the whole article, okay? So the introduction is the first part of any research study. It's usually not going to be titled introduction. That's just an expected since it appears at the beginning of the study article. But no matter whether it is qualitative or quantitative or a mixed methods type study, it's going to basically give you an argument of why this is an important topic to pursue. Why should I research this study? Why did the researchers spend their time and energies and money to actually conduct their study? So that is the problem statement, the study's significance, why the study was needed, and it describes the background of the topic under investigation. So what are the core concepts? Are they looking at nursing burnout? Are they looking at role transition stress? Are they looking at caregiver role strain? Whatever the concepts are that they're studying, they will present them and explain what they mean in the introduction. So there should also be a purpose statement or a statement of purpose that tells you the point that the researchers were trying to make by doing this study. So were they aiming to discern relationships among their study variables? Was their objective to see if X intervention caused Y outcome? You should be able to read the purpose statement and understand what the rest of the study is going to look like and what information you should see later on in the article. Not all research studies are going to present research questions. Because of space limitations in publications, oftentimes research questions are pretty much the same thing as the purpose statement, just in the form of a question. So to save space in publications, they often don't always put the study questions. Um, for hypotheses, if you're looking at a quantitative study, you may see hypotheses. Qualitative studies, you would not see hypotheses. That would not be a part of a qualitative study. There's typically going to be a review of literature um, that gives you some background on the topic and tells you what studies have been done prior to this one. And oftentimes that is used to show why this study you're reading was needed. So all these other people have published about this topic, but there's still a big gap. We don't know the answer to this question, so that's the purpose that my study is trying to fulfill. Okay, so you'll see that. Sometimes publishers will put the review of literature in its own little subsection, and they may call it review of literature or literature review. Otherwise, it's just kind of all intermingled in the introduction. They may or may not give you a theoretical or conceptual framework, but if there is one that they want to call attention to, it would be in the introduction typically. Okay, so the method section is going to look different dependent on whether you are looking at a quantitative versus a qualitative kind of study. So this slide shows you what you would expect to see in the method section of quantitative. Just a note, method is the correct title based on APA, the American Psychiatric Association, I think that stands for. I should have known that, psychological. Anyway, the publication guidelines, and they call it method in the singular. Sometimes you will see, depending on the publisher, it might say methods or methodology or study procedures, but it's the methods section. Basically, that's the step-by-step of what the researchers actually did to put their study into place. So it's going to tell you what design the study was done using. So different kinds of quantitative or qualitative study designs. It's going to tell you how they got their sample. So how did they recruit participants? What kinds of participants were allowed or excluded from the study? It'll talk about ethical protections. So your like institutional review board approvals, what kind of informed consent or assent processes were done, how did they maintain confidentiality or anonymity, that kind of stuff would be found in the method section. The biggest portion of a quantitative method section is probably the third bullet. It goes over data collection. And data collection is going to be some way that is very systematic using formal instruments that can be converted into numbers. So how do they measure their variables and collect their data? So usually that's going to be questionnaires, surveys, or some kind of like biophysiologic data like blood pressure or serum cortisol levels or your weight, body mass index, that kind of stuff. So they will walk you through how they actually collected the data and assured that the data collection instruments were reliable and valid. That should be in there as well. And then they tell you at the end, typically, of the method section, their data analysis plan. So they will tell you the types of statistical analyses that they were going to run to answer each research question. So you might see things like descriptive statistics, like means or ranges, standard deviations, frequencies, t-test, ANOVA, chi-square tests, um, multiple regression analyses, logistical regression, odds ratios. Like they're going to basically list the statistical tests they're going to use to answer which of the research questions. Oftentimes they tell you what statistical software they're going to use, like Stata or SPSS, that kind of stuff. So that's going to be at the end of the method section. For qualitative studies, the method section looks quite different. So there are some similarities. Obviously, they're going to tell you their design. So was it a phenomenological study, a grounded theory study, using which approach? Corbin and Strauss, which approach to their qualitative design did they use and why? They should justify that. They will tell you their sampling plan, what kind of participants and how did they recruit them. Ethical protections obviously definitely has to be in there. But they typically, in qualitative studies, are going to focus more on the setting and the context of the study, not the story. So the setting and the context of the study provides a rich description that helps us transfer these findings to um, to our own practices. So you have to have that rich description of the setting in which the study took place. And then there's not going to be necessarily discussions about reliability and validity. That falls more under quantitative. With qualitative, it's going to be more about enhancing the trustworthiness or the integrity, believability of the study. So they'll talk about using different methods like triangulation or audit trails or a bunch of different things. That's a totally separate video. I have another video about maintaining the integrity of quantitative and qualitative studies. So there's a different video on that. Results. This is where a lot of people get lost in the weeds in quantitative studies. Obviously, quantitative studies, the results section's going to have a ton of data. There's going to be statistical tables and probably all kinds of numerical and statistical symbols that you don't understand um, unless you've taken statistical tests, statistics classes, and have really like read articles enough to understand how to interpret them. But within a quantitative studies results section, you should be able to find the names of the statistical tests that they used that should match what they said they were going to do in the methods section. Typically, it's going to be symbols. So you would have to understand what the symbols were. Also the values of the calculated statistics. So was the t test value 1.15? And then there's always going to be this thing called the level of statistical significance. Some people call that the p-value, the probability value. And what that is, it's an index of how probable those findings are correct or reliable. How much trust can we place in these statistical results? Because remember, statistics is fallible. It's based on probability rules, and probability rules are not 100% accurate. If we don't choose the right statistical test to run our analyses, we may have faulty assumptions. And that's way beyond the purpose of this video. Um, Please know that this is done in jest. I don't try to make my students cry. I personally love statistics, honestly, but I know most students don't. So this is kind of just a real brief taste of statistical significance. This has to do with hypothesis testing. I have a whole video on hypothesis testing, so I'm not getting into that. But how sure are we that the statistical results we received from our sample in our study are accurate, are correct, believable? This p-value, it's a lowercase italicized p, tells us the chances that we got it wrong. So there's usually a cutoff. It's technically called the alpha level for the study. But most of the studies you read in nursing and many other disciplines use a p-value of 0.05 or less as the cutoff for statistical significance. Depending on the type of study that's being done or the types of statistical tests that are being run, sometimes that needs to be tighter. So sometimes the p-value is set as less than or equal to 0.01. So you should be able to find what the alpha level is or the cutoff point at the end of the methods section in their data analysis plan. They should tell you what their benchmark is. So how you interpret this, if my p-value, my level of statistical significance for a statistical analysis I run is 0.05, you think of that is 500ths. So that means that if I were to repeat this study 100 times, 95 times I would get statistically significant results, just like I got. 5 times out of 100, I would get something else. It would be a different kind of non-statistically significant result. So that means I'm 95% sure. This is kind of another way to think about this. I'm 95% confident in the results that I got from this study. And for the most part, researchers are okay with 95% confidence and a 5% error rate. You're never going to have 100. There's no such thing as a 100% p-value, like a 0.0000000. Sometimes you'll see a 0.0001. That's very good. That's very strongly statistically significant. So anyway, here's a little table that kind of breaks this down. Most of the time, 0.05 is the cutoff, but again, not always. You need to read the study. Sometimes it is more rigorous or tightly controlled, such that 0.01 is the cutoff. Um, so obviously, the smaller the number, the better statistical significance, or the more sure that we are that the results are correct. So you can take a moment and pause the video and look at this table, but you will often see p-values presented in the results section among data tables. That's typically where they're found. So this is just a snapshot of a couple of results tables that I pulled from an article, and we're not even going to try to dissect what all of this means. I just want you to look at the p-values. Most of the time you'll see them in their own column. I have another example in the next slide that looks a little different, and that's a different way that sometimes researchers present that. So you'll notice that for this one, this was a visual analog scale. That's what VAS stands for. And obviously these folks, these researchers collected data at baseline, probably before an intervention, and then 2 weeks after intervention and 4 weeks after intervention for both the control group and the intervention group. And so for each one of those time points, we have a p-value. So that means for each statistical test we run, we get the test result, and then we get the, which is this, the Mann-Whitney U test. That's a non-parametric test, but that's a different video. And then you get an associated p-value. So the fourth week is the only one that is considered statistically significant because the p-value is 0.000. Again, that does not mean it's 100% accurate. There's a 1 down there somewhere. They just cut it off at 3 digits. But that's pretty strongly statistically significant. So what does that tell us? How do we interpret that? Without looking at the whole rest of the article, it's kind of difficult. But what this tells me is that I can look at the median of the intervention group and the median of the control group, and the intervention group that got whatever intervention this was has a lower pain level than the control group does, 2.0 versus 5.5. And what this is telling me is that's not just because of chance. That's actually a difference. That means I can interpret this as my hypothesis that the intervention caused decreases in pain is supported by this data. This is not due to chance. The intervention really did cause these decreases in pain. That's how we interpret that. For the bottom table, it's the same study, but this is the quality of life score, not the pain score, so a different variable. And again, at the fourth week, we see that we just met the level of statistical significance. 0.049 is statistically significant. So that means that the intervention group does have a statistically significant higher quality of life at 4 weeks after intervention than the control group does. So honestly, this can be daunting. I understand it's tricky. The good thing and the reason I did this is to show you that you cannot just look at tables. If you only look at a table like this and you don't read the text that accompanies the table, you're missing something. Okay, so the table goes with the text in the results section. You need to read both of them, and then you'll have a better understanding. And what I always tell students to do, don't be afraid of these tables. You can learn a lot just by getting a pen or working on your computer and highlighting things and trying to figure them out. Look at the table, try to break it apart and see if you can figure out how to interpret that, and then go to the text and read. Were your interpretations correct? Did you understand how to look at these tables? The more you practice it, the better you get. And it's definitely helpful to do that if you plan to go on to or in graduate school. You need to know how to dig and break apart these tables like that. So practice. Look at the table, try to figure it out, see what the interpretation you get from the data, and then read the researcher's interpretation. And the more you practice it, the more closely you'll interpret that correctly. Here's another data table. So this example up here that I'm looking at is a correlation matrix. So it is 4 different study variables: quality of life, health promoting behaviors, optimism, and parental stress. And again, I'm not even sure what article I got this from. I just use this for example. So the way that we look at these is different because you don't see a p-value. The numbers that are being shown in a correlation matrix are the actual correlation coefficient. That's the test statistic value. So you see, you need to learn to get in the habit of reading footnotes. So this footnote down here tells us that the asterisk means that the p is less than 0.01. That must have been that study's cut point. So anything that has an asterisk beside it means it was statistically significant. So I'm not going to go through this whole table, but there are, in a lot of nursing studies that you look at, use correlation matrices like this. These are typically non-experimental studies, but they could be experimental studies as well. Um, but what we're looking at is variable 1 is quality of life, and variable 3 is optimism. So I'm going to start my finger at optimism 3 and move across until I get underneath 1. That number, that 0.50, means that there is, with an asterisk, means that there is a statistically significant positive correlation relationship between variable 1, quality of life, and variable 3, optimism. So that means the more optimistic the person is, the higher their quality of life. Now, if you go down to the next one, you see the negative sign. That means there's a negative or an inverse correlation, and that also has an asterisk. That means it's statistically significant. So how I interpret that is I move from 4 underneath 1. So that means there is a statistically significant negative correlation between parental stress and quality of life. So the higher the level of parental stress, the lower their quality of life score. They move in opposite directions. And a positive means they both go up or they both go down. They move in the same direction. And then here's another table, and I'm not going to get into that, but you can see it's more similar to the other one we looked at, where there's a separate column for p-value. So typically you'll either have statistical significance in its own little column like this, or it will have asterisks or some other kind of notation that you have to read about in the footnote of the chart. So quantitative, again, if you're freaked out about statistics, you just have to get into them. That's the best way to learn how to read and understand them. For qualitative studies, though, you won't find data tables full of statistics. You still may find tables. Often there are tables that include the core study findings, which are themes, and sometimes you'll see them broken down into sub-themes. And then there may be exemplar quotes that go along with those themes and sub-themes. So you do have tables. Sometimes there will actually be a little statistical table in a qualitative study. It's typically talking about the demographics of the people who participated. So they may tell you the mean age of the participants or their mean years of experience as a nurse or a teacher or whatever they're studying. But beyond demographics, you won't really see statistics, okay? What you will see is quotes from the participants. That's called raw data. That's the actual words that the participants said in their interviews or in their diaries or focus group sessions, however they collected data. So here's some snapshots of an actual qualitative research study article. And you can see that these are actual quotes from the participants. And I'm not going to sit and read all of these. You can pause. I encourage you to do so and read through those. What you will find when you read qualitative studies, they're typically very rich, informative, often emotion invoking quotes. That's what the researchers pulled. So if we were looking at this as a theme of unnecessary pain or a sub-theme of unnecessary pain, oftentimes the researchers don't have a lot of room, so they can't just put a ton of quotes in here. So they typically try to find the most impactful quote that most embodies that theme or sub-theme. So if you read this quote right here that the researchers have chosen, they feel that that most embodies what unnecessary pain meant to the participants in their qualitative study. The last section before the reference list, of course, is the discussion section. And whether you're looking at a quantitative or a qualitative study, all of these items should be found in a discussion section. First of all, the researchers are going to interpret their results. So the results section is great, but it's not a standalone. You're going to see a lot of data, you're going to see a lot of quotes in qualitative studies, but what did those results actually mean? And how did they answer our research question? So the discussion section is going to interpret what was the answer to our study's question. Were our hypotheses supported or were they not supported? You'll see that kind of stuff. Also, what typically happens is you're going to see the researchers are going to take their study findings and they're going to compare them against other studies that have been published. So you may see things like the results of our studies correspond to the results of Martin's study, who also found that blah, blah, blah. Or perhaps you may say that the findings of our study conflict with other published research, which found the opposite results of our study. So one of those two things is probably going to be seen in the discussion section. And what that's doing is it's lending corroboration to the results. So my study found that this finding occurred, and so did these other studies. So that makes my study look stronger because I'm not in a little bubble over here. These other studies also support these findings, and that makes my findings more believable to the reader. The implications for practice, implications for research, implications for policy or education. Implications are the what's next. So what? So you found these results. What do we actually do with them? So an implication for practice goes directly to the bedside nurse on the front line working with clients. How can that nurse use the results of this study to be impactful in patient care outcomes? That's a clinical implication. A research implication is going to be what gaps are still there. So there's still unanswered questions. So a research implication is going to say, based on the study results of this study, there's still unanswered questions. Future studies need to focus on A, B, C. We need to make sure we have larger, more diverse sample sizes. We should incorporate multiple sites to have a more diverse sample. So they're going to give researchers for future studies get points based on the failings of our study or based on the findings of our study. This is what future studies need to do. Sometimes you'll see health policy implications. That's very true in like health disparity type research or times where policy needs to change based on the results of this study and others that support it. So you may see things about legislative changes that need to happen or nurse advocacy or policy type implications. And sometimes the implications relate to education, nursing education. So what do nurse educators need to do to impact future nurses based on the findings of this study? And then lastly, but certainly not least, the researchers themselves are in the best seat to be able to see the limitations of their study. No study is perfect. I don't care how much time and effort you put into it. No study is without flaws and bias. So the researchers who actually did the study should inspect their study and they should be very open to the reader and tell them these are the weaknesses of our study and this is what that could mean to the believability of these outcomes. And sometimes they will turn their study limitations into a research implication. So one limitation of our study was that we had a very small sample size at only one hospital. Future studies should focus on increased sample sizes at multiple hospitals to increase the generalizability of these study results. So that's definitely something you should see in the discussion section. If you don't see study limitations, that always raises a red flag for me. What are these researchers trying to hide? Because every study has a limitation and they should very clearly detail that in their discussion section. So this hopefully has given you a good understanding of the IMRaD format and what you will expect to see when you open up a quantitative or a qualitative study. if you open up an article that you retrieved from an online source, a database, something like that, and you don't see a methods section that talks about the different methods that researchers undertook in their study, and you don't see a results section with new data, whether it's quant or qual, you're not looking at a research study. Okay, so anytime you have to find a research study for an assignment in a class, you need to make sure you look at IMRaD, Introduction, Method, Results, and Discussion. All right, thanks for listening.